Target confirmed, 200 meters east. Hold fire. Team, cover the flanks. Report any movement. Copy. On my mark.
8:47 a.m. Tuesday. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The first mortar round hit Building C before the last echo of the morning's training drill had finished crossing the bay. There was no warning, no escalation, no radio chatter in the seconds before impact. Just the flat blue California sky, the smell of salt and gun oil, and then nothing that would ever be the same again. But that is not where this story begins. This story begins 3 hours and 47 minutes earlier in the dark. 5 a.m. at Coronado feels different from 5 a.m. anywhere else in the world. The base does not wake up slowly. It does not stretch or ease into the morning the way a civilian town does, with coffee makers gurgling and dogs walking in quiet yards. Coronado snaps awake like a rifle bolt, cycling home sudden, mechanical, and with complete intention. By the time most of America is reaching for its alarm clock, the men who train here have already been moving for an hour. Nora Harlow had been moving for longer than that. She arrived at the 800-meter range at 0452, the same way she had arrived every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 2 years, quietly alone and before anyone else was watching. She carried a canvas maintenance bag over one shoulder, a clipboard under her arm, and walked with the gait that had become so familiar to this stretch of asphalt and concrete that it had stopped registering as unusual a long time ago. Her left leg did not quite keep pace with her right. It never had, not since the training accident 4 years ago that had ended a path she had barely been allowed to start walking. The injury was not dramatic to look at. She did not use a cane. She did not grimace. The left leg simply lagged by a fraction of a second on each stride, a small mechanical delay that most people noticed once and then forgot, the way you forget a minor imperfection in a painting after standing in front of it long enough. Nora had never forgotten it for a single day, but she had also never let it slow her down. Not here, not when the work mattered. She set her bag down at the near end of the range and stood still for a moment, the way her grandfather had taught her to stand still before doing anything else in a new environment. She breathed in salt air from the bay. The faint chemical bite of cleaning solvent from the equipment shed 30 yards to her left. Something heavier underneath gun oil and brass, and the scorched earth smell of a range that had been used hard the day before. She exhaled. Then she pulled a small notebook from her breast pocket and wrote down 4 numbers without looking at anything in particular. Wind speed from the northwest 7 knots. Temperature 61 degrees. Humidity 74%. Barometric pressure 29.92 falling. She had taken these measurements every morning she worked this range. She recorded them in a notebook that no one had ever asked to see, because no one had ever imagined that a range maintenance specialist would have a reason to track atmospheric data before she started replacing target boards and sweeping up brass. They would have been wrong about that, but they never asked. Nora worked the range methodically, the way her grandfather had taught her to do everything that mattered. She walked the full 800-meter corridor first, noting the condition of the ground, the target frames, the concrete barriers positioned at the 200, 400, and 600-meter marks. She checked the steel brackets on each frame, testing them with both hands, feeling for micro vibrations that meant a weld was starting to fail. She replaced 3 target faces that had been shot through past the point of useful measurement and cleared debris from the drainage channel running along the western edge of the range. She did this in near silence, with no music and no phone, just the sound of the base coming awake around her and the distant cry of something large moving across the water. The SEAL teams would arrive at 700 to begin their morning training cycle. They would use this range from approximately 0800 to 1100, running precision shooting drills with service rifles, and on Tuesdays with the heavier Mark 11 sniper platform that required the full 800-meter corridor. By the time they arrived, every target would be set, every frame would be secure, every piece of equipment would be in exactly the condition required. They would not notice any of this. They never did. This was not bitterness, exactly. Nora had spent enough time thinking about it to understand the distinction. Bitterness was something that ate at you, something that wanted feeding. What Nora carried was quieter and more durable than bitterness. It was patience of a very specific and disciplined kind, the patience of a person who knows with complete certainty what she is capable of and who has learned to exist in a world that has not yet figured out how to see her. Her grandfather had a name for it. He called it the distance between the shot and the sound. You fire and then you wait. The bullet travels, the target falls, the sound arrives last. You do not need the confirmation to know the shot was true. You were there when the trigger broke. You felt the hold, the breath, the calculation. The sound is just the world catching up. Raymond Harlow had told her that in a field in Montana when she was 11 years old on a cold October morning, When the frost had stiffened the grass and the target downrange was barely visible through the scope, she had made the shot. She had lowered the rifle. She had waited. And when the confirmation came, that flat crack of impact drifting back across the distance, she had understood at 11 years old that the waiting was part of the work. She was still waiting. But she had never stopped being ready. At 06:18, she reached the equipment shed on the western edge of the range and unlocked it with the key that hung from a clip on her maintenance bag. The shed was utilitarian in the way everything at Coronado was utilitarian, built for function, indifferent to aesthetics, organized by people who had decided that efficiency was its own form of beauty. Metal shelving along two walls, ammunition boxes stacked in a specific order, cleaning supplies on the lowest shelf in the exact sequence that the range maintenance protocol required. Range Maintenance Protocol 7.4. Nora had memorized it so completely that she no longer needed to consult the laminated card mounted beside the door. She knew the inspection sequence, the restocking sequence, the end-of-day shutdown checklist. She knew it the way a musician knows a piece of music they have performed 1,000 times, not by thinking about the notes, but by feeling them arrive in the right order. She had never questioned where the protocol came from. Until this morning, she was reaching for the cleaning souvenir on the second shelf when the morning light coming at a new angle through the shed's single-high window fell across the original mounted instruction card in a way it usually did not. The laminate had yellowed at the edges. The card itself was a photocopy of a typed original, and in the lower right corner, in the small institutional font of a military documentation stamp, there were 8 words she had never stood close enough to read clearly. She stood close enough now. Range Protocol 7.4, developed by Master Sergeant R. Harlow, 1987. The solvent bottle was in her hand. She did not remember picking it up. She read the line again. Master Sergeant R. Harlow, 1987. 34 years before Nora had first walked through the gate at Coronado, her grandfather had built the system she was maintaining. He had written the protocol that told her which shelf held the cleaning supplies. He had established the inspection sequence she followed every Tuesday and Thursday morning before the men with the expensive training and the institutional authority arrived to use the range he had designed. Raymond Harlow had been here before any of them, and his granddaughter was mopping up after them. She set the solvent bottle down very carefully. She stood in the shed for 63 seconds without moving. Then she picked the bottle back up, finished restocking the shelf, locked the shed behind her, and went back to work. She had been taught that the waiting was part of the shot. She had not stopped believing it. At 700, SEAL Team 5 arrived. They came the way they always came, in a loose, confident formation that was simultaneously casual and precise. The walk of men who had operated in environments where ordinary confidence would get you killed and had emerged with something harder and more functional than mere arrogance. They carried gear. They talked in the shorthand of people who had been through things together that required no full sentences to reference. Commander Marcus Kellen led the formation. He was 38 years old and built like a man who had decided that his body was a professional instrument and had maintained it accordingly for 16 years. His hair was cropped close on the sides. His eyes were the shade of gray that photographs as blue and reads in person as something colder and more calculating. He had a scar below his left ear that he had stopped noticing in mirrors approximately a decade ago. He did not notice Nora either. This was not cruelty. It was something more mundane and, in its own way, more complete. He had developed a professional taxonomy of the people in his operational environment, and Nora Harlow fit cleanly into a category that required no further analysis. She was support personnel. She maintained the range. She was reliable and professional, and she kept the equipment in good order, which was exactly what her role required. He had never learned her name in 2 years. Nora had understood this for a long time. She continued replacing a target frame at the 400-meter mark, working with the focused efficiency that was its own form of camouflage as the team moved past her and spread into their training positions. Kellen stood at the near end of the range with Petty Officer Briggs, his designated marksman, reviewing the morning's drill sequence on a tablet. Briggs was 29 and had been shooting competitively since he was 14. He was objectively measurably good, with a record of confirmed accuracy that Kellen had cited in more than one after-action report as an operational asset. Nora had watched him shoot from across the range for 2 years. She knew 3 things he was doing wrong with his breathing sequence. She knew that his left-hand grip was creating a micro-torque on the forend of the rifle that was costing him approximately half a minute of angle at 600 meters and more at distance. She knew that in crosswind conditions above 10 knots, he was systematically under-adjusting because his wind reading technique relied on a formula that worked at the ranges he had been trained on, but broke down at the atmospheric conditions specific to this corridor in the morning hours. She had never told him any of this. He had never asked. The team ran their drills from 0800 to 0930 with the focused intensity that was the whole point of being here. Nora worked around them, staying to the edges, visible only when the range required maintenance, and invisible again the moment the requirement was met. She had developed a precise spatial awareness of where each team member was at every moment, not because she was tracking them deliberately, but because situational awareness had been built into her at a level below conscious thought, the way breathing was built, in the way the ability to read a wind line across grass was built in. Her grandfather had done that. He had started teaching her when she was 8 years old on his ranch in rural Montana, 20 miles from the nearest town, and a long way from any place that would have recognized what was happening in that high field as the transmission of a rare and serious expertise from one generation to the next. Raymond Harlow had been 61 years old when Nora was born. He had retired from Army Special Forces after 22 years with a shoulder that had been rebuilt 3 times and a service record classified at levels that his own family was not fully cleared to read. The official citation for his last operational deployment mentioned his name once and described his contribution in terms so carefully vague that they could have applied to almost anything. The unofficial record passed between people who had been there was considerably more specific. 112 confirmed engagements, 89 confirmed kills at ranges beginning at 400 meters and extending on 2 documented occasions, past the point where most military sniper programs stopped measuring. A service philosophy that his teammates described years later as almost supernatural in its patience and precision. He had never talked to Nora about the numbers. He had talked to her about the principles. "You are not trying to shoot the target," he had told her on that cold October morning, the frost stiff in the grass, the target barely visible at the far end of the field. "You are trying to understand everything that stands between you and the target, the wind, the distance, the elevation, the temperature, your own heartbeat, and then you are finding the single moment when all of those variables align and you are releasing the shot into that alignment. The rifle is just the tool. The mind is the weapon." He had paused, watching her settle the crosshairs. "And they will never check your mind, little bird. That's the advantage." She had made the shot. She was still making it. At 10:15, the morning training cycle wound down and Kellen gathered his team for a debrief at the near end of the range. Nora moved to the far end, beginning the process of resetting targets and clearing brass. She worked without watching them present in the physical space and from their professional awareness. She was crouched at the 800-meter mark, removing a target frame bolt with a socket wrench when she heard Briggs mention something about the upcoming deployment timeline. She was not trying to hear it. Sound carried differently in the morning air, and the conversation floated across the range in pieces. 6 weeks. Yemen. Classified extract. High-value target. She did not look up. She did not alter her pace. She filed the fragments with the quiet efficiency she applied to everything and kept working. What she did not know was that someone else had been filing those same fragments for much longer than she had. Nora had first noticed the anomalies 11 days ago. She had been working the observation tower at the north end of the range complex, replacing a corroded light fixture on the upper platform when she found the boot prints. They were on the exterior ledge of the tower, 34 feet above the ground, on the narrow maintenance walkway that wrapped the perimeter of the upper platform. The ledge was approximately 18 inches wide and had no practical function except to allow access to the exterior lighting and the antenna mounts on the tower's outer face. Nobody should have been standing on that ledge for any legitimate reason, but someone had. The prints were partial, the ball and outside edge of a right boot repeated in 3 positions, corresponding to a person who had stood on the ledge and turned facing outward, facing the range, facing the hills that rose above the western perimeter of the base in a long, gradual elevation that gave an unobstructed sight line across the entire training complex. Nora crouched and studied them for a long time. She measured the approximate stride spread with her hand. She estimated the boot size. She noted the tread pattern consistent with a military-style boot, but not with any standard-issue footwear she recognized. She looked at the direction the prints faced outward toward the hills, and then she looked at the hills themselves. She noted 3 things about the hillside above the western perimeter that had not been true 2 weeks ago and were true now. The vegetation pattern on the near slope had been disturbed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would register in a casual scan, but there were 3 locations along the ridgeline where the scrub brush had been compressed and partially flattened in patterns inconsistent with wind or animal movement, and very consistent with a person lying prone facing downward, observing. The drainage channel running along the base of the western perimeter fence had a section of chain link that had been carefully lifted and resecured. The resecuring was almost perfect. Almost. The timing of the security rotation on the western perimeter had shifted by 45 minutes in the last 2 weeks, creating a window between 02:15 and 03:30 when coverage of the hillside observation angle was reduced. She wrote it all down that evening. The next morning, she typed it into a formal observation report using the range safety incident template, which was the closest available form to what the situation actually required. She documented each anomaly with location date, approximate time, and a factual description. She kept the language neutral and specific, the way her grandfather had taught her to keep everything accurate, first interpretive, second and only as interpretive as the evidence actually supported. She walked the report to Captain Gerald Decker's office at 08:30 on a Wednesday. She had not expected warmth from Decker. She had not received it in 2 years of working under his administrative authority and had stopped expecting it approximately 23 months ago. Decker was 54 years old and carried the institutional certainty of a man who had spent enough years inside a system that he had begun to mistake the system's limitations for the world's limitations. He was not stupid. In his own domain, by his own metrics, he was competent. He processed paperwork efficiently. He maintained schedules. He ensured the administrative machinery of the base training facilities ran with the grinding consistency that the people above him required. He had no mechanism for receiving information from people below him. He looked at the report for perhaps 12 seconds. Then he looked at Nora. It was a look she had seen before in different offices behind different desks. The look of a man who has decided that the most efficient response to information he does not want is to return it to where it came from. He said, "I appreciate the diligence. These ranges produce a lot of foot traffic. People access the tower for legitimate maintenance. Wind patterns disturb vegetation. I'll make a note." She waited. He was already looking back at his desk. "Was there something else?" she said. "Sir, the fence section on the western perimeter has been manually manipulated. That is not consistent with maintenance access or wind." He said, "I'll make a note." She left. She did not know as she walked back across the range in the 08:45 morning light that Decker had waited for the door to close before he picked up the report again. She did not know that he read it more carefully the second time with the attention of a man checking whether he had been seen. She did not know that after reading it through twice, he tore it in half once, and then in half again, and dropped the 4 pieces into the metal wastebasket beside his desk. She did not know that in the upper left corner of his office, at the junction of wall and ceiling, a security camera covered the room's interior for base safety monitoring purposes. She did not know that the camera was recording. She would find out. But not yet. She found the letter 3 days later. She had not been looking for it specifically. She had been going through the baugh of her grandfather's personal effects that she kept in the closet of her apartment in Coronado, a flat cardboard box with a masking tape label in her aunt's handwriting that said simply Raymond's papers, looking for a photograph she remembered from her childhood that she wanted to frame. The box held the things that did not fit into formal categories. There were 3 handwritten letters to her grandmother dated 1971 from a location Raymond had never specified more precisely than overseas. There was a pocket Bible with a broken spine and the names of 8 men written on the inside back cover in pencil in 2 columns and added at long intervals in a handwriting that had grown smaller and more careful over time. There was a set of shooting medals from civilian competitions, which Nora had known about, and a set of military citations she had only partially understood as a child and had never fully read as an adult. And there was an envelope. Her name was on the front, not her full name, just Little Bird in her grandfather's handwriting, the letters formed with the same careful precision he had brought to everything physical. She sat down on the floor of her closet with the box in her lap and opened it. The letter inside was dated March 2019. Raymond had died in January 2021. He had written this letter nearly 2 years before his death, which meant he had written it with intention and deliberateness, which meant every word was exactly the word he had chosen. She read it twice before she trusted herself to keep going. He had written, "I know where you are right now. Not the address, I mean the position. You are exactly where I put you, and you are exactly where you need to be. The system will not open its door if you knock on it. That is not how it works. But there is one place where it cannot keep the door closed if the moment arrives, and that place is Coronado. I have spoken to Earl Crandall. His number and address are below. He knows what I know. He was there when I was there. If the moment comes and you need a witness for anything, Earl will come. He owes me a debt that neither of us has ever called in. I am calling it in now in your name. There was a phone number. There was a San Diego address. Below the address in the last line of the letter in handwriting, slightly larger than the rest, as though he had wanted it to be read separately, "The rifle is just the tool, little bird. The mind is the weapon. I built the system they're using. Now you're going to show them what it was built for." She sat on the floor of her closet for a long time. Then she folded the letter and put it in her wallet where she had kept it every day since. 8:46 a.m. Tuesday. The training cycle had been running for 40 minutes. Kellen's team was at the 600-meter firing line running transition drills between the service rifle and the Mark 11. The morning air had warmed 4 degrees since Nora had taken her first readings. The northwest wind had shifted slightly, south of west, and increased to 9 knots. She was at the far end of the range replacing the last target frame of the morning when she noticed it. The hillside above the western perimeter. 3 positions in the scrub brush at the same locations she had documented 11 days ago were occupied. Not visibly. Not in a way that would register to anyone who was not looking for them, who had not memorized the exact contour of that ridgeline and cataloged the precise location of every shadow and every shrub in the morning light at this angle. But she had memorized it. She had been memorizing it for 11 days ever since she had first found the boot prints on the tower ledge. The scrub was compressed in those 3 places. And in one of them, in the second position from the right, there was a straight line that did not occur in nature. The barrel of a rifle catching the morning sun for the fraction of a second it takes the light to shift. She straightened up slowly. Her hand was steady. Her breathing was even. Her mind was already doing what it had been trained from childhood to do. Reading the geometry, calculating the angles, mapping the fields of fire from those 3 positions against the layout of the range complex. She looked at where Kellen was standing. She looked at where his team was arrayed along the 600-meter line. She looked at the main administration building, 200 yards behind them, where the base's duty officers would be beginning their morning rotation. She understood what she was seeing with the cold clarity of a person who has spent a lifetime learning to see what is actually there rather than what is expected. And then the world stopped being quiet. 8:47 a.m. The first mortar round hit Building C. The sound arrived before the understanding did a concussive pressure she felt in her chest, before she heard it as noise, a rolling compression that traveled outward from the impact and hit her at the 800-meter mark like a hand flat against her sternum. The building erupted in smoke and debris. The echo came back from the hills and then was swallowed by a second explosion closer to the east. Then the small arms fire began. From 3 positions on the western hillside that she had already mapped. She did not run for cover. She stood at the 800-meter mark and watched the geometry unfold the way her grandfather had taught her to watch everything important completely without flinching, reading every element of the pattern before she moved a single step. Kellen's team was in the open between the firing line and the range facilities. 2 men were already down. The enemy had the high ground on 3 sides. The QRF was not here yet. The Mark 11 was in the equipment shed. She had the key. Her left leg pulled slightly as she began to move. She did not slow down. The world does not fall apart all at once. It falls apart in sequence, one system failing after another, each failure creating the condition for the next. The way a structure under load does not simply collapse, but first bends, then cracks, then loses the capacity to carry what it was built to carry. You can see it happening if you know what to look for. Most people do not know what to look for. They are still processing the first crack when the wall comes down. Nora Harlow had been taught to see the sequence. She was already reading it. The second mortar round hit the eastern perimeter fence at 08:48:31 seconds after the first. It was a ranging shot. She recognized that immediately from the pattern. Not an attempt to hit a specific target, but a correction from the first impact. The methodical geometry of an indirect fire team that knew what it was doing. Somebody on that hillside had a spotter. Somebody had a radio. Somebody had done this before. The third round, which arrived at 08:49 and hit the vehicle lot behind the main administration building, confirmed it. They were walking the fire in. Nora reached the equipment shed at a controlled run, her left leg managing the pull through simple force of accumulated habit. 4 years of adjusting, compensating, redistributing, until the adjustment was no longer adjustment, but simply the way she moved. The pull was there as it always was, but it had long since stopped being a problem and had become a mechanical fact of her, no different from a right-handed shooter accounting for their dominant eye. She moved with it rather than against it, and the distance closed. She had the shed unlocked before the 4th mortar round landed. The Mark 11 was on the second shelf from the top, secured in a padded, hard case because range maintenance protocol required all long gun platforms to be cased and secured when not in active use. She had followed that protocol every day for 2 years. She had cleaned this rifle, checked its zero, verified its action, and returned it to this case more times than she could count. She had never been authorized to shoot it. She pulled the case from the shelf, set it on the workbench, and had it open in 12 seconds. The rifle was in the condition it was always in when she finished with it, clean, lubricated, zeroed to the same 600-meter baseline the team used as a standard reference. She did the function check from memory, not because she needed to think about it, but because the habit was built deep enough that skipping it would have felt like leaving a door unlocked in a dangerous neighborhood. Chamber bolt trigger assembly, scope mount. She verified the scope setting, noted the current zero, and began calculating in her head the adjustments required for the atmospheric conditions she had recorded at 0452 that morning. Wind now from the west-southwest at approximately 11 knots, having shifted from the earlier northwest reading. Temperature up 4 degrees from the morning baseline. The targets on that hillside were at ranges she had already measured, not because she had planned for this specific situation, but because measuring ranges was what her mind did when it was looking at a landscape. The two primary positions were at 600 and 680 meters. The third, the one from which she had seen the rifle barrel catch the light, was further back and uphill, closer to 800. She picked up the rifle and the spotting scope, slung both, and came out of the equipment shed into the noise and smoke of a base that was no longer what it had been 4 minutes ago. Kellen had his team in cover. Not good cover. The range facilities had not been designed for defensive use because nobody builds a sniper training range with the assumption that it will need to defend itself. The concrete barriers at the 200-meter mark provided partial protection from the eastern firing positions, and the two equipment sheds on the western edge offered some concealment, though concealment was not cover. And Nora could see from 400 meters that two of the barriers had already taken direct small arms fire. 2 men were down. Petty Officer Briggs was against the leftmost barrier, his back to the concrete, left hand pressed to his right shoulder, his face tight with controlled pain, focused outward rather than inward, the way trained men hold themselves when the body is loud and the work is louder. The shoulder of his shirt was soaked through. He was holding his service rifle across his lap with one functional arm, watching the hillside with the professional attention of a man who fully intended to keep shooting despite the fact that his primary shooting arm was no longer cooperating. Petty Officer Wade was behind a toppled target frame, 40 meters to Briggs's right, both legs extended, unable to move. He had his radio handset in one hand and was talking fast and low into it, calling the QRF, calling base command, calling anything that would come. The rest of the team was distributed along the near end of the range behind whatever solid material they had reached in the first 60 seconds. 5 men in various states of cover, all of them taking fire from positions selected with the specific intention of preventing any of them from doing what they were trained to do, which was move aggressively toward a threat and overwhelm it. The enemy had the elevation, they had the sight lines. They had prepared their positions in advance, which meant they had good angles and known distances, and the psychological advantage of attackers who have studied the terrain, while the defenders are still trying to understand what terrain they are defending. Kellen was at the center barrier, his radio in one hand, his pistol in the other, because his service rifle had taken a round through the receiver in the first exchange. He was conducting his team with hand signals and radio traffic, holding the defensive line with the focused competence of a man who understood that leadership in a deteriorating situation is not about inspiration. It is about preventing the deterioration from accelerating. He was doing everything right. It was not going to be enough. Nora covered the ground between the equipment shed and the nearest barrier and came into cover beside Kellen as enemy rounds sparked off the far side of the concrete. Neither of them flinched. She said, "I can take the tower. North observation platform. I have clear angles on all 3 primary positions from that elevation." He said, "Your range maintenance." She said, "Your designated marksman is bleeding out against that barrier with one working arm. Your QRF is 15 minutes away. You have 5 men who can't advance and can't hold indefinitely." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "I've had this rifle in my hands every week for 2 years. I know it's zero. I know this range. I know those positions on that hillside. I mapped them 11 days ago and reported them to Captain Decker, who chose not to forward the report. I am telling you now what I told him then." Kellen looked at her. The gray eyes that had looked through her for 2 years were doing something entirely different now. They were reading her the way he would read any operational element in an environment, factually without sentiment, with the specific professional question of whether this asset could perform the function required. From behind the left barrier, Briggs's voice came across rough with pain. "Sir, she maintains the range. She doesn't shoot it." Kellen did not look away from Nora. 30 seconds passed. To his right, a burst of automatic fire walked across the concrete apron of the range and stopped 6 feet short of Wade's position. Kellen said, "Wade, give her the spotting scope in the secondary radio," then looking directly at Nora Harlow. "Get to that tower," she went. The observation tower stood at the north end of the range complex, 80 meters from the nearest cover and fully exposed to the western hillside for approximately 40 meters of the approach. The tower was a steel frame structure, 40 feet high, with an enclosed observation platform at the top and an exterior access ladder on the north face that put the ladder on the building's blind side relative to the primary enemy positions. The 40 meters of exposed ground between the last cover position and the tower base was the problem. Nora solved it the way her grandfather had taught her to solve terrain problems, not by ignoring the exposure, but by making the calculation honestly and then moving through it with the speed that gave the exposure the shortest possible window. She waited for a pause in the incoming fire from the central hillside position. Enemy fire is not continuous, it is rhythmic, and she had been reading the rhythm for the last 4 minutes, and when the pause came, she moved. The exposed 40 meters took her 9 seconds. Her left leg pulled on the third stride and on the seventh, and again, as she hit the base of the tower ladder and grabbed the first rung with both hands and began to climb. The Mark 11 was slung across her back and the spotting scope across her front, and the secondary radio clipped to her left shoulder, and 40 feet of steel ladder with 11 pounds of rifle and 4 pounds of optics is not a trivial physical problem. Under any conditions, let alone these ones. She climbed. Below her, she heard the crack of service rifles as Kellen's team used the distraction of her movement to put fire on the hillside positions, suppressing while she climbed, which was not something she had asked for, and which moved her briefly in a way she filed away for later. She reached the platform in 40 seconds and pulled herself through the access hatch into the enclosed observation deck. 4 walls of bulletproof glass scratched and sun-faded, giving her a 270-degree view of the range complex, the western perimeter, and the hillside above it. A narrow steel shelf along the north and west faces designed for spotting scopes and note-taking. She set up in 11 seconds. The Mark 11 on the west-facing shelf bipod deployed stock adjusted to her length of pole. The spotting scope to her left positioned so she could transition between them without shifting her center of gravity. The radio clipped to the shelf edge at her right hand. She keyed the radio. Her voice was level. "Ground, this is Overwatch. I am set in the north tower. I have eyes on all 3 primary positions. Confirm your radio check." Below, Kellen's voice came back immediately. "Overwatch ground. Good copy. Read you clear. What do you see?" She was already looking. The 3 positions on the hillside were as she had mapped them 11 days ago, occupied now with the certainty that turned a hypothesis into a fact. The leftmost position at 600 meters held a 2-man team, a shooter and a spotter lying prone in the compressed scrub, the shooter using a precision rifle with a suppressor that had reduced but not eliminated the sound signature. The center position at 680 meters was a single shooter, disciplined and still firing in controlled bursts that suggested careful ammunition management. The rightmost position, furthest back along the ridgeline at approximately 800 meters, was occupied but not currently active. Waiting, she understood, for the other positions to drive the defenders into predictable cover before the final engager took the shots that mattered most. This was coordinated. This was rehearsed. This was the product of planning that had gone on long enough that the people on that hillside knew the range complex the way she knew it. She told Kellen what she saw. Then she said, "Priority target is the leftmost position. 2-man team, 600 meters. The spotter has a radio handset he's calling fire corrections. If I take him first, it disrupts their mortar adjustment. Kellen, take the shot when ready." She settled into the rifle. The 600-meter shot, with its specific atmospheric conditions and the partial scrub concealment, required her to read the spotter's body position from the visible fragments and calculate center mass from the evidence rather than from direct observation. It was not a simple shot. It was the kind of shot that required everything she had been taught and everything she had practiced, and the quality of patience that is not passive but is a form of extreme active attention. The mind processing every variable simultaneously while the body holds completely still and the crosshairs settle and the breath moves in its counted rhythm and the world narrows to a single point of alignment between intention and reality. Her grandfather's voice, not remembered, but present the way certain things become present in the moments that require them. You are not trying to shoot the target. You are finding the moment when everything aligns. She found it. The first shot broke at 600 meters. The spotter dropped. The mortar fire, which had been building toward another adjustment, went silent and did not resume. Below, through the radio, 3 seconds of nothing. Then Petty Officer Davis, one of the younger team members, said something that was not quite a word. Kellen's voice came back, clipped in professional Overwatch ground. "Confirm first target," confirmed, she said, transitioning to center position. The 680-meter shot required a 2.1 MOA adjustment for the wind and a 1.4 MOA elevation change from the previous hold. She made the adjustments by feel the clicks of the scope turret counted without looking, because she had made these adjustments on this scope in this atmospheric range so many times that the numbers lived in her fingers rather than in her conscious mind. She settled, she breathed, she waited for the alignment. The second shot broke 43 seconds after the first. The center position went still in the way that things go still when stillness has become permanent. From below, Davis again. The same almost word, quieter this time and more serious. The sound of a young man revising something fundamental about his understanding of the world. She was already transitioning to the third position. It was the third shot that stopped her. Not the shot itself, the shot had not happened yet. What stopped her was the target. She had the rightmost position in her scope, the furthest back along the ridgeline at approximately 790 meters, and she was reading the shooter in the way she read all targets factually in pieces, assembling the technical picture from observable evidence. Prone position, right-handed precision, long gun platform of domestic manufacture. Good natural barricade use. He had positioned himself with his supporting elbow on a slight rise of ground that gave him a stable platform without requiring any artificial support. Efficient, difficult. Difficult in a specific way. She had seen that elbow placement once before in a photograph her grandfather had shown her when she was 16, a black and white image from a training document he had brought back from his last years of service. He had shown it to her as an example of a method of ground use that he had developed over 20 years and refined into something that was as far as either of them knew his alone. The photograph had been of himself taken by a spotter during a qualification exercise. The elbow on the rise, the body angle, the way the rifle sat in the pocket of the shoulder. The shooter in her scope was using that method. Not a version of it, not something adjacent to it or inspired by it, the method itself. The exact placement, the exact angle, the exact relationship between the body and the ground and the rifle that Raymond Harlow had spent 2 decades developing and that existed as far as Nora had ever known only in that photograph and in the knowledge her grandfather had passed to her directly. Her right hand was steady. Her breathing did not break from its rhythm. But something behind her eyes went very quiet and very cold. Not fear, not hesitation, but the specific feeling of encountering something that was not supposed to exist. She filed it. She made the shot. The third position went still. She came off the scope for 3 seconds. Below, the rate of incoming fire had reduced significantly. The mortar rounds had stopped after the first target went down, confirming that the spotter had indeed been the fire adjustment link. She keyed the radio ground overwatch. 3 targets confirmed. I am identifying 2 additional positions at the base of the ridge line eastern side. Stand by. Kellen, standing by. Outstanding work, Overwatch. She did not respond to that. She was already looking at the eastern base of the ridge line through the spotting scope, reading the new geometry. The information arrived at 0913. Kellen received it from base command over the encrypted channel, and when he relayed the relevant portion to the team, the quality of the silence that followed was different from the silence after the first and second shots. That silence had been amazement. This silence was something harder. He relayed it to Nora on the secondary radio in the flat tone of a commander who has learned to deliver bad information without adding emotional weight to it because the people receiving it need to process it clearly and cannot do that if the person delivering it is also processing their own reaction at the same time. The attack had not been random. It had not been a general assault on the base. It had been a targeted operation against SEAL Team 5, specifically timed to the period when the team was known to be at the range complex in a configuration that would leave them exposed. The intelligence that had made this targeting possible, the team composition, the training schedule, the 6-week deployment timeline, the destination, the nature of the mission was classified at a level that made its presence in an enemy operational plan not merely a breach, but a specifically sourced breach. Somebody inside Coronado had provided it. The QRF was now 7 minutes out. Kellen did not say who inside Coronado. He did not know yet. But Nora, sitting in the tower with the third shot still settled in her hands like a physical fact, thought about an office. She thought about a man who had read her report with the attention of a person checking whether he had been seen. She thought about the way he had said, "I'll make a note," the second time after she had mentioned the fence. She filed it. She went back to the scope. The fourth and fifth shots reminded Nora of something her grandfather had told her about the difference between shooting and solving. Anybody can fire at what they can see, he had said. A sniper fires at what they understand. The fourth target was a machine gun team that had set up in a drainage culvert at the base of the western perimeter fence, a position almost invisible from ground level that had been suppressing the main base entrance for the last several minutes, preventing the early elements of the QRF from reaching the range complex. She could not see the team directly. She could see the muzzle blast signature bouncing off the culvert's concrete interior, and she could calculate from the blast pattern where the gun's receiver was positioned relative to the culvert's geometry, and from that she could derive the hold that would put the shot through the gap between the culvert wall and the gun shield at the required angle. It was not a shot in any manual. It was a shot that required you to have built the mental model of the problem completely enough that you could shoot the solution rather than the target. She took 4 seconds longer on this one than on any of the previous shots. The shot was true. The fifth target was moving. An enemy spotter retreating along the upper ridgeline toward a position further north, using the terrain folds to stay below the tower sightline, which would have been effective against anyone who had not spent 11 days memorizing every fold and shadow on that ridgeline. Nora tracked him for 8 seconds, reading his movement pattern, calculating his next 3 terrain decisions from the options the ground offered him, selecting the one he would take because it was the best option, and trained personnel under pressure used the best option available. She put the shot into that terrain feature 2 seconds before he arrived at it. Below, the incoming fire had reduced to isolated sporadic rounds. The coordinated engagement of the first 15 minutes had degraded into the uncoordinated noise of a force that had lost its key personnel and its command structure, and was now making individual decisions rather than executing a plan. She keyed the radio ground overwatch. 5 confirmed. Enemy fire is disorganized. Recommend pushing your eastern element toward the perimeter fence while the suppression holds. Kellen moving now. Then Briggs' voice came on the radio. He should not have been on the radio. He was wounded and his transmission was irregular, the voice of a man managing real pain while forming coherent sentences which Nora recognized as an act of significant will. He said, "Overwatch, this is Briggs. I need you to describe the shooter in the 3rd position." The way he was using the ground. She looked at the 3rd position through the spotting scope. She described what she had seen: the elbow placement, the body angle, the rifle position in the pocket of the shoulder. There was a pause on Briggs's end long enough that she thought the radio had cut out. Then he said, "I trained under an SF instructor 4 years ago. Washout from special missions. Man named Rucker. He had a specific ground technique he said he'd learned from a master. Said the master was a ghost named Harlow." Another pause. "Rucker got court-martialed 18 months ago. Conduct unbecoming. He dropped off the grid after that." Nora was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about her grandfather's letter. "The system will not open its door if you knock on it." She was thinking about a man who had taken something given to him, honestly knowledge passed in the tradition of one practitioner teaching another, and converted it into currency of a different and uglier kind. She was thinking about the 3rd target, the still figure on the ridgeline, who had died using a technique Raymond Harlow had spent 20 years developing and never used for anything except keeping his people alive. "Understood," she said into the radio. "I'll have more for you after the engagement." She went back to the scope. The 6th target appeared at 0921. He had held his position through the entire engagement, which told her everything she needed to know about his training, his discipline, and his role. He was not a shooter, or not, primarily. He was command. He had positioned himself on the upper ridgeline at a range she now measured at 820 meters behind a natural rock formation that would have concealed him completely from ground level and from the North Tower at any angle except the very specific one she currently occupied, which she suspected he had not mapped when he planned this operation because he had not planned for someone in the North Tower. He had a radio. He had a spotting scope. He had been managing this entire operation from that position for the last 34 minutes, and now he was doing what command personnel do when an operation has failed, preparing to disengage. 820 meters. Moving target within the next 60 seconds. Partial concealment behind the rock formation. Wind at 11 knots from the west-southwest, which at this range would push the bullet approximately 4 inches to the right, a point of aim requiring a corresponding left offset, precise to within a quarter minute of angle to thread the gap between the right edge of the rock and the body behind it. This was the hardest shot of the morning. It was not the hardest shot she had ever made. She settled into the rifle and let the world reduce to the essential geometry. The crosshairs, the wind, the distance, the gap between the rock and the body, the breath, the heartbeat in the pause between beats where the body is briefly still. The single moment in the cycle where the hold is as perfect as it is going to be. She had been taught to take the shot in that moment. She waited for it. 4 seconds. 8 seconds. 12 seconds of complete stillness in the observation tower above Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, while below her an enemy operation collapsed and a SEAL team pushed toward the perimeter fence, and a QRF was 3 minutes out, and a wounded man with one working arm watched the North Tower with an expression she could not see, but would have recognized if she could. The moment arrived. She took the shot. The figure behind the rock formation went still. The radio in his hand dropped to the ground beside him. The upper ridgeline became quiet in a way it had not been since 0847. The sporadic fire below lasted another 90 seconds. Then it stopped. She came off the rifle. She sat back on the steel shelf of the observation platform and looked at the scope and the rifle in her hands, which were steady, the same way they had been steady for the last 41 minutes, because steadiness was not something she performed, but something she maintained the way a structure maintains its load until the load is lifted and then holds what it was built to hold. Outside the tower glass, the base settled into the aftermath quiet that comes when a great noise has finally ended. Not really silence, but the absence of everything the noise had been covering. Emergency vehicles in the distance. Radio traffic from base command. Human voices confirming that they were still there. She began the post-engagement sequence. She cleared the rifle, verified the action, reset the scope to the standard 0. She did this in the methodical order that the protocol required. The same protocol developed by a man who had understood that the habits you build in training are the habits that carry you through the moments when building new habits is not an option. Range Protocol 7.4. Master Sergeant R. Harlow, 1987. She secured the rifle, slung it, and began to climb down. Kellen was at the base of the tower when she reached the ground. The whole team was there, 4 able-bodied men in various states of adrenaline and relief, and something else, something more complex, the expression of people who have encountered something they have no category for and are in the process of building one. Davis had his hands on his knees and was breathing deliberately. 2 others were watching her with open, slightly stunned faces, the way you look at something you have been looking at for 2 years and are only now actually seeing. Briggs was there too, on his feet, his shoulder field dressed, pale but present. He watched her differently from the others, not with the stunned openness of men who had simply not known. With something more specific, the look of a man who has been wrong in a way that costs more than being right, would have gained, and who is honest enough to know the difference. Kellen stood in front of her and looked at her the way she had looked at those hillside positions 11 days ago, completely without flinching, reading everything that was actually there. He was seeing her for the first time. The left leg that pulled slightly when she walked, the hands that were not shaking, the rifle across her back, the 2 years of mornings on this range in this air, with this scope doing work that had never been called by its right name. The QRF arrived 4 minutes later to find an attack completely neutralized 6 enemy combatants down across a 400-meter stretch of ridgeline, and a SEAL team alive and intact because a woman in maintenance coveralls had climbed an observation tower under fire and made 6 shots that none of them could have made at ranges that some of them had never attempted in training in conditions that the instructors who had rejected her application 3 years ago had never thought to evaluate. Kellen looked at the rifle in her hands. Then he looked at her face. For 2 years, she had been the range maintenance specialist, the woman who replaced the targets. He did not say anything yet. There would be time for words later. There would be inquiries and reports and hearings and all the machinery of an institution attempting to process something it had not been built to process. And there would be a room with a table and people behind it asking questions that should have been asked 3 years ago and were going to be asked now because there was no longer any alternative. But that was later. Right now, in the smoke settling quiet of a Tuesday morning at Coronado Commander, Marcus Kellen stood in front of Nora Harlow and understood, with the clarity that comes from evidence that cannot be argued with, that he had been standing next to the most capable shooter on this range for 2 years and had never once thought to ask her name. She handed him the rifle. Her left leg pulled slightly as she turned. She did not slow down. The QRF arrived at 0931. 12 men in full kit moving fast through the main gate and spreading across the range complex with the organized urgency of a force told there was still an active threat that had not yet been told there was not. Their team leader, a compact staff sergeant named Pryor, reached Kellen's position in under 2 minutes and spent 30 seconds receiving the situation report before his eyes moved almost involuntarily to the woman standing at the edge of the group in maintenance coveralls with a rifle slung across her back. He looked at Kellen. Kellen said, She's with me. Pryor looked at the hillside. He looked at the 6 positions on the ridgeline that were no longer active. He looked back at Nora with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that is coming out to an answer he did not expect. He did not say anything else about it. There were wounded to move and a perimeter to establish, and a base command that needed a situation report, and the machinery of institutional response was already engaging the way it always does after something violent has happened, in a place supposed to be controlled with thoroughness and speed and the bureaucratic momentum of an organization that processes events by filing them, analyzing them, and deciding what they mean in terms of the categories it already has available. Nora understood what was coming. She had understood it in general terms since the moment she had picked up the Mark 11 from the equipment shed shelf. She had made the calculation, then not reluctantly, not with resentment, but with the clear-eyed honesty her grandfather had taught her to apply to all calculations, including the ones about herself. She had known that doing what needed to be done would require her to answer for having done it. That was acceptable. The alternative was not. She handed the rifle to the QRF armorer when he came to collect weapons for post-incident processing. She surrendered the spotting scope and secondary radio to the equipment NCO. She answered Pryor's initial questions with factual precision. Her name, her role, her location. When the attack began, her actions during the engagement in sequence without editorializing. She did not say she was sorry for any of it. She was not. The formal inquiry convened 4 days later in a conference room in the base's administrative building. The same building that Building C had stood beside before the first mortar round had reduced a significant portion of it to rubble and the rest to a construction project that would take 18 months and a substantial appropriation to address. The room was plain and well lit and smelled of the institutional neutrality of rooms used for a long time to process difficult things without any decoration that might suggest an opinion about what those difficult things meant. A long table, 8 chairs on one side, 2 on the other, a recording system. A window looking out onto the range complex where Nora could see if she turned her head, the target frame she had been replacing when the attack began still standing at the 400-meter mark in the quiet morning air, as though nothing had interrupted the ordinary Tuesday that had briefly ceased to exist. She did not turn her head. The panel included 2 JAG officers, a senior enlisted advisor, a base commander from a neighboring installation brought in for institutional distance, a representative from Naval Special Warfare Command, and at the far right end of the table, Captain Gerald Decker, who had requested inclusion in the inquiry on administrative grounds and whose request had been granted before certain information had come to light that would in time make the granting of that request a matter of some institutional embarrassment. Decker sat with the composed authority of a man who has decided his best defense is the projection of confidence. It was a posture that worked well when the authority behind it was unquestioned. It worked considerably less well when the room contained evidence. The JAG officer on the left, a lieutenant commander named Holt, opened with the procedural questions. He was efficient and treated Nora with the professional courtesy of a lawyer who has decided the facts alone are interesting enough. He walked her through the morning chronologically, and she answered each question with factual precision. Her name, her role, the atmospheric readings she had taken at 0452, the target positions she had identified on the hillside, the timeline of her observations going back 11 days. She described each of the 6 shots in technical terms. Range, wind conditions, hold outcome. She did not describe them as remarkable. They were what they were. Holt asked, "At what point did Commander Kellen authorize your use of the weapon system?" She said, "He directed me to move to the tower after I presented the tactical situation, and he assessed that the team's designated marksman was unable to continue." Holt asked, "Did you consider whether you were qualified to operate the weapon system in a combat situation?" She said, "I am qualified to operate the weapon system. I have maintained this specific rifle and verified its 0 on a weekly basis for 2 years. I have operated comparable platforms in civilian training contexts at ranges exceeding those engaged this morning. My qualification is not credentialed by this institution, but it exists independent of whether this institution has chosen to document it." A brief silence followed that. Holt wrote something down. From the far right end of the table, Decker said, "The panel should note that range maintenance personnel are explicitly prohibited by base protocol from operating the weapon systems they maintain. Whatever the result of this morning's actions, there is a clear procedural violation that he did not finish the sentence." The door to the conference room opened. A base security officer entered and leaned down to speak quietly to the JAG officer on the right. What he said produced a sequence of changes across the panel table. Neutral attention, shifting to alert focus, and in the case of 2 members, something not quite discomfort but immediately adjacent to it. The security officer placed a USB drive on the table and left. Holt looked at it, Then he looked at Decker with the steady, neutral attention of a man who has just been handed a fact and is deciding precisely how to deploy it. He said, Captain Decker, the administrative security footage from your office, do you have any objection to the panel reviewing it? The room changed in the 3 seconds before Decker answered. It changed the way rooms change when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, when a door has been opened that the person who built it never intended to open. Decker's composure did not collapse. Composure built over decades does not collapse in 3 seconds. But it shifted, a fractional adjustment in the angle of his shoulders, a stillness that was different from the stillness of confidence and very similar to the stillness of calculation. He said, I have no objection. He said it 2 beats too slowly. Holt said, thank you, we'll need a short recess. He looked at Decker and not at Nora when he said, Captain, please remain available outside. It was the most precise sentence Nora had heard in a formal proceeding. She sat in the waiting area for 40 minutes. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her eyes on the middle distance, which was something her grandfather had taught her in situations where waiting was the work not to fidget, not to speculate, not to spend the energy of attention on things outside her control. She had spent enough of her life waiting in rooms that were deciding things about her to have developed a relationship with the experience that was neither comfortable nor distressing. It simply was. She was in it, and she would come out the other side, and what mattered was not the waiting, but the condition she was in when it ended. She thought about the third shot. She had been thinking about it intermittently since the moment she had come off the scope on the tower platform, the way a technical problem continues working in the background, while the foreground is occupied with other things. The shooting signature, the elbow placement, the technique that her grandfather had spent 20 years developing, appearing on a hillside above Coronado, in the hands of a man using it to kill the people she had been watching train for 2 years. Briggs had given her part of the answer. Rucker, a name, a history, a vector of transmission from Raymond Harlow's knowledge to that morning's ridgeline. A man who had been taught something honest and converted it into something else, and who had, in the end, sent that conversion back to the place where the original knowledge had been built in the hands of people trying to destroy it. That was not the whole answer. The whole answer lived somewhere in the investigation now underway, in the chain of transmission from Rucker to the people on that hillside, in the question of who had connected Rucker's knowledge to an operation requiring specifically targeted intelligence about SEAL Team 5's deployment schedule and the classified mission waiting at the end of it. She was not the person who would answer that question. She was the person who had made it possible for the question to be asked. That was enough. The door to the conference room opened. Holt appeared in the doorway and looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent 40 minutes recalibrating his understanding of a situation he thought he understood. He said, Ms. Harlow, please come back in. The room had changed in the 40 minutes she had been outside it, not physically. What had changed was the arrangement of authority, the invisible topography of who was confident and who was not, which had shifted in her absence in a way immediately readable to anyone who knew how to read rooms. And Nora had been reading rooms since she was a child, watching adults decide things in her grandfather's kitchen in Montana. Decker was no longer at the far right end of the table. His chair was empty. The 2 JAG officers sat slightly differently, with the uprightness of people who have received information that has made them aware they are now in a proceeding of greater consequence than they had initially understood. Holt did not explain the empty chair. He said, Ms. Harlow, we've reviewed the security footage from the base administrative building. I want to confirm for the record that you submitted a written observation report to Captain Decker's office on the morning of Wednesday the 14th, 11 days before the attack. She said yes. Holt said, and Captain Decker's response was to decline to forward it through the base security chain. She said, he told me he would make a note. He did not forward the report. Holt looked at the USB drive on the table. He said, the footage shows Captain Decker destroying the physical copy of your report approximately 4 minutes after you left his office. The footage also shows him making a call from a personal device to a number that base security is currently tracing. He paused. This proceeding is being suspended pending a broader investigation. You are not the subject of that investigation. I want to be clear about that. Nora said, I understand. The Naval Special Warfare Command representative, who had said nothing through the entire first portion of the proceedings, said, Ms. Harlow, I want to ask you something off the record. She looked at him. He was 52 years old and had the face of a man who had spent enough time around exceptional people to know one when he saw one. He said, why did you stay at Coronado after they turned down the training application? After the 3rd time. Why stay? She looked at the window in the target frames at the 400-meter mark and the hills above the western perimeter quiet now in the morning light, ordinary again, in the way that places become ordinary again after the extraordinary thing is finished. She said my grandfather told me this was the right place to be. Commander Marcus Kellen came to see her that evening. She was at her apartment 6 blocks from the base gate, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her grandfather's letter spread flat in front of her. She had been reading it again, not because she needed to, she had it memorized, but because some things require physical presence to be fully real. He knocked. She let him in. He stood in her kitchen in civilian clothes, looking slightly uncertain, in the way that very competent people look when they have entered an environment where their competence does not map. And she let him be uncertain for a moment because she thought it was probably good for him. He said, I owe you more than I know how to say. She said, you don't owe me anything. You made the right call when it mattered. A lot of commanders wouldn't have. He said, that's a low bar. She said, yes. He sat down across from her without being invited, which she noted as a sign that he was treating her as a person whose space he could enter, rather than a subordinate whose space was his by default. A small thing, not a small thing. He looked at the letter on the table. He looked away quickly enough that she understood he recognized it as private. He said, tell me about him. She had not expected that. Not. She looked at him for a moment to confirm he was asking what she thought he was asking, and he was not asking for operational information or training records or anything that served the institutional process now underway. He was asking about a person. She told him. She told him about the Montana ranch and the October mornings and the frost in the grass. She told him about the competitions where she had shot under a false name because Raymond had understood years before she did that her real name attached to those scores would attract the wrong kind of attention. She told him about Range Protocol 7. 4 in the moment in the equipment shed when the morning light had fallen on the stamp in the lower right corner, and she had stood there with a bottle of cleaning solvent in her hand and understood with the full weight of understanding, rather than the abstract knowledge she had always carried, that her grandfather had built the system she was maintaining. She told him about the letter, not all of it. But the part that mattered, that Raymond had placed her at Coronado deliberately, not out of desperation or limited options, but from a strategic understanding of how closed systems work and what it takes to open them. That he had known the door would not open from the outside. That he had found the one place where the door had no choice. Kellen listened the way good operators listen, with the whole body oriented toward the information and nothing filtering it before it arrives. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he sounds like someone I would have followed anywhere. She said, everyone who knew him said that. He said, I'm putting in the recommendation tomorrow. Direct commission. Naval officer. The paperwork is already drafted. I had Holt review it this afternoon. He paused. There will be a process. It won't be instant. But I want you to know it's going in. She said, I know. He looked at her. She said, he told me it would happen this way. Not the specifics, but the general shape of it, that the moment would come and the institution would have no choice. He was right about most things. Kellen looked at the letter on the table one more time and then looked at the window. He said, there's something else you should know about Decker. She waited. He said, he wasn't just negligent. The investigation found a pattern going back 14 months, contact with an intermediary connected to the group that planned the attack. Timing of communication consistent with the transmission of operational information, including the Team 5 deployment timeline. He is in custody. He paused. The report you filed 11 days ago, if it had been forwarded, the attack would likely have been prevented. Base security confirmed that today. The room was quiet. Nora looked at her coffee cup. She thought about the 12 seconds she had stood in Decker's office and watched him say, I'll make a note, in the tone of a man filing something in a drawer he never opens. She thought about the 4 pieces of her report in his metal wastebasket. She thought about what 11 days of inaction by one man in one office had cost. There was nothing useful to add to what had already been said. She asked how are Briggs, and Wade Kellen said Briggs is out of surgery. They expect full recovery in the shoulder, maybe 90% function, which he is apparently furious about and which his surgeon considers a rousing success. Wade is walking, slowly and not happily, but walking. She said, good. He stood to go. At the kitchen door, he paused and looked back at her, and there was something in that look different from everything that had come before it in 2 years of working in the same physical space without occupying the same professional reality. He said, your grandfather built this place. You just proved it still works when the right person is watching. She held his gaze for a moment. She said, he was right about most of it. He left. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter and the cold coffee and the quiet of a Wednesday evening in Coronado, And for the first time since she had arrived at the range at 0452 on a Tuesday morning that had turned into something she had been preparing for her entire life, she allowed herself to sit without working, without filing, without maintaining anything. She had fired. She was waiting for the world to catch up. Earl Crandall arrived on a Thursday. He drove himself from San Diego in a 1974 Ford pickup that was the same dark green it had been when he bought it new. The year he came back from overseas maintained with the same philosophy. He applied to most things that what was built right and cared for honestly had no reason to stop working just because time had passed. He was 74 years old and walked with a cane he had been using for 3 years and did not apologize for. His hair was white and his hands were large and permanently calloused from 50 consecutive years of physical work. His eyes were a clear, light brown that had not changed color since Nora had seen him in the single photograph her grandfather had kept of the two of them together, taken in 1984 in a bar somewhere in North Carolina. Two men in civilian clothes holding bottles of beer and looking at the camera with the relaxed ease of people who have recently survived something and are taking a moment to notice that they had. He found her at the range. She had been back at work for 2 days, which had surprised some people and not surprised her at all because the range still needed maintenance and nobody else was doing it, and the work was the work, regardless of what else was happening. The investigation was ongoing. The inquiry was suspended. The recommendation was in. None of that changed the fact that the target frames at the 400-meter mark needed new faces, and the drainage channel had developed a debris blockage that would cause problems in the next rain. Earl Crandall walked to the 400-meter mark with his cane and stood watching her work for a moment before he spoke. He said, "You look like him, the way you move." She stood up and looked at him, and he looked at her. And 41 years of a debt that Raymond Harlow had never called in stood between them in the morning air. She said, "He told me about you, not the details, but that you were there." Earl said he told everyone who needed to know, and nobody who didn't. He looked at the hills above the western perimeter, quiet in the morning ordinary again. "I heard what you did," she said. "He prepared me for it." Earl reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, a canvas work jacket worn at the cuffs, the jacket of a man who is not trying to make an impression, and removed an envelope. It was heavy cream-colored stock, the kind that suggests the contents matter. Her name was on the front in her grandfather's handwriting, which she had been reading all her life and which still stopped her breath slightly every time she encountered it, the same way you pause when you turn a corner and find yourself looking at a landscape you had forgotten you loved. She took it. Earl said he gave it to me in 2019 with specific instructions. He said, "When the moment comes at Coronado, you'll know. Take it to her in person. Don't mail it. Don't give it to anyone else." He paused. "I've been carrying it for 5 years." She opened it. The letter inside was 3 pages long for Raymond Harlow, who believed that economy of language was a form of respect for the person receiving it. She read the first page where she stood at the 400-meter mark with Earl Crandall watching the hills and the morning spreading across the range in the particular way it does when you are paying attention to it. Her grandfather had written, "Little bird, if you are reading this, then the moment came. I knew it would, not because I am prescient, I am not, but because I understand systems and I understood this one, and I knew that a system built on the exclusion of capability will eventually be confronted with that capability in conditions it cannot control. And in those conditions, the system has no choice but to see what it refused to see when the choice was available. I built the conditions. You provided the capability. That is how it was always going to work." She turned to the second page. He had written, "There is a man named Rucker. I know about him. I knew about him before you did, which is why I want to tell you this now, when you have had time to think about it, rather than in the heat of whatever came before. Rucker was trained honestly by a man named Garrison, who trained under me in the 80s, and he was a good technician before he became something else. What he became is not about the technique. It is about the character. The technique is neutral. What it is used for is the choice of the person holding it. You used it to protect people. He used it to harm them. The technique is the same. The choice is everything. Do not let what he did with the knowledge poison your feeling about the knowledge itself. It was given honestly. That it was misused is his failing, not the knowledge's and not yours." She turned to the third page. He had written, "I placed you at Coronado because it was the right place, not because you had no other options. You had other options, and you would have found your way regardless because you are your father's daughter and your mother's daughter and my granddaughter, and the blood runs true. I placed you there because the institution needed you specifically in that specific place at the moment when it would have no choice but to acknowledge what it had been refusing to acknowledge. I could not have told you this beforehand. The knowing would have changed the waiting, and the waiting had to be genuine. I am sorry for that. I hope you understand why it was necessary. I think you do. I think you have always understood things before you had the language to say them, which is the quality I most hoped you would carry from our time together in that field. The last paragraph was short. He had written, "The rifle is just the tool. The mind is the weapon." You proved it. I always knew you would. Come home to Montana when this is finished. The ranch is yours. The field is still there. I expect the grass is overgrown. Raymond, she folded the letter. Earl was looking at the hills. She said, he knew. Earl said he always knew. That was the thing about Raymond. He could read the ground 20 years ahead the same way he could read it at 800 meters. He just saw things. He paused. He also told me to tell you one more thing in person that he didn't put in the letter. She waited. Earl said she is going to want to go back to being invisible when this is finished. She is going to want to return to the edges and the routine and the quiet. Tell her that the work she was built for is not done. Tell her that the work she was built for has just started. He looked at her steadily. He said it would be obvious when you heard it. She looked at the range. The target frames, the drainage channel with its debris blockage, the equipment shed with the laminated card on the wall, the hills above the western perimeter ordinary and sun-touched in the morning light. She said it is. The formal inquiry reconvened 6 weeks later with Decker absent and 2 additional investigators from Naval Criminal Investigative Service present. Nora answered the same questions she had answered before and several additional ones. The expanded investigation required all with the same factual precision she had always applied to questions that deserved honest answers. The inquiry's final report, classified at a level limiting its distribution to a small number of commands, documented the attack, the response, and the sequence of events that had made the response necessary. It documented Decker's role in the chain of events and the ongoing criminal investigation into his activities. It documented the intelligence breach and the investigative process working to trace its full extent. It documented the connection to Rucker and the line of transmission that had carried Raymond Harlow's technique from an honest training relationship to a hillside above Coronado where it was used against the institution it had been built to serve. And it documented in the section marked individual performance 6 shots at ranges between 600 and 820 meters made under enemy fire from an elevated position in atmospheric conditions that the report's technical reviewer described as challenging, by any standard measure, by a range maintenance specialist with no formal military sniper qualification and a left leg that had not functioned at full capacity for 4 years. The report's technical reviewer, a Master Chief Petty Officer from the Navy's elite sniper training program, wrote 3 sentences in his assessment. He wrote, "The marksmanship demonstrated exceeds the documented performance of the current top 5 percentile of active-duty naval snipers at comparable ranges and conditions. The atmospheric calculation applied to each engagement reflects training and experience well beyond any standard curriculum." I have no technical explanation for how this performance was achieved by someone outside the institutional pipeline, and accept that the institutional pipeline does not have a monopoly on producing this level of capability, and this event should cause serious reconsideration of the criteria by which that pipeline identifies and evaluates candidates. Kellen's recommendation for direct commission was approved 9 weeks after the attack. The process was not instant, as he had told her. There were forms and evaluations and a physical that the examining physician conducted with the thoroughness of someone briefed on what he was evaluating and why, and whose notes on the left leg read chronic limitation, managed effectively, not operationally disqualifying at current functional level. There were interviews and background checks and the slow administrative transit of paperwork through channels that move at their own pace regardless of the urgency of what they contain. Nora went back to work at the range every morning during this period. She was still the range maintenance specialist. The status had not changed yet, and until it changed officially, it remained what it was, and the work remained what it was, and she did it with the same precision and attention to detail that the protocol required. The SEALs who trained on the range treated her differently now, not with gestures or speeches, but in the small ways that matter more than either. They learned her name. They acknowledged her presence when they arrived. Briggs, 6 weeks after surgery, came to the range for the first time since the attack and walked directly to where she was working at the 600-meter mark and stood in front of her. He said, "I was wrong about you. I want you to know that I know that." She said, "You made the right call with the radio. That information mattered." He said, "It was the least I could do." She said, "It was what the situation needed." "That's enough." He nodded and went back to the firing line. Davis, who had been the youngest member of the team, approached her one morning with the direct energy of a young man who has encountered something that permanently altered his frame of reference and has decided to be honest about it. He said, "I want to know how you made the fifth shot. The moving target. I've been trying to work it out." She said, "What have you come up with?" He said, "I think you calculated his next position based on the terrain options and shot where he was going to be." She said, "That's right." He said, "How do you learn to do that?" She said, "You learn to read terrain until the terrain tells you what the person in it will do. It takes time. Start with the basics and build from there. It's not a single skill. It's a collection of smaller skills that add up." He said, "Would you be willing to show me?" She looked at him. She said, "When I have the appropriate standing to do that, yes." He nodded with the understanding of someone who recognizes that the appropriate standing is on its way and the waiting is not the same as a refusal. The morning of the commission ceremony was clear and cold the way San Diego mornings are in November, when the marine layer has pulled back and the sky over the bay is the specific blue that makes you understand why people come here and stay. Nora stood in the courtyard of the base administrative complex in the uniform that had been fitted for her 6 days earlier naval officer's dress uniform, the fabric holding its shape in the November air, the left trouser leg hanging over a left shoe planted slightly differently from the right one, as it always was, as it always would be. Kellen was there. Briggs was there, his shoulder at what his physical therapist called maximum medical improvement, 88% of pre-injury function, which he had told Nora was unacceptable, and she had told him was fuel. Wade was there walking without assistance. Davis was there standing straight in a way that suggested he had thought about how he was standing. Earl Crandall was there in his canvas work jacket, his cane planted on the courtyard pavement, watching with clear brown eyes that had been watching things for 74 years and had learned to recognize the ones worth watching. The ceremony was brief and official, conducted by the base commander, with the precise formality the institution applies to the moments when it is conferring something on someone, a formality that Nora had once found cold and now found fitting because the formality was not indifference. It was the institution's way of saying, "This is real, this is recorded, this is permanent." When it was finished, Kellen shook her hand. He looked at her with the eyes that had learned to see her and said quietly enough that only she could hear it, "Your grandfather built this place. You just proved it still works when the right person is watching." She held the handshake one beat longer than protocol required. She said he was right about most of it. Kellen almost smiled. The Advanced Marksmanship Program orientation class convened for the first time on a Monday morning in January, in the range facility building at Coronado, in a room that had been used for briefings and debriefs for decades and smelled of the combination of coffee and gun oil and institutional carpet that it had always smelled of and would smell of for as long as the building stood. 14 students. They ranged from 22 to 38 years old, drawn from across the special operations community on the basis of a qualification process revised in the months following the attack to address the specific gap that the Master Chief's assessment had identified. The revision had been procedural and quiet, implemented without ceremony, which was how the institution preferred to acknowledge it had been doing something wrong, not with via speech, but with a policy change, which was in Nora's judgment the more honest form of acknowledgement because it was the one that actually changed something. Briggs was in the front row. His shoulder had reached maximum medical improvement. He had told Nora the 88% was unacceptable. She had told him that the 2% gap was going to teach him things about precision mechanics that full function had never required him to learn. He had written that down. She stood at the front of the room and looked at the 14 people looking back at her, and she thought about a field in Montana in a cold October morning and a grandfather who had understood decades before she did that the distance between the shot and the sound is not empty space. It is full of everything you did to make the shot true. She said, "The first thing I'm going to teach you has nothing to do with a rifle. It has to do with a field. For you fire at something, you are going to learn to read everything that stands between you and it, the wind, the distance, the terrain, the temperature, your own heartbeat, all of it, because the rifle is just the tool." She paused. 14 people were very still. "The mind," she said, "is the weapon." She picked up the chalk and turned to the board, and her left leg pulled slightly as she stepped forward, and she did not slow down. And the work that Raymond Harlow had spent a lifetime building and a life's ending arranging for the right person to continue began on a Monday morning in January, in the only place it could have, exactly as he had always known it would.